My wife and I bought a house at a very low price. I didn't think it was weird at the time, we were just glad we saved a lot of money, but now I understand why we got the house so cheap. After visiting the house, we made a small repair, and at first everything was wonderful. However, then strange things began to happen. One night, my wife and I were woken up by a terrible noise. It felt like something had crashed to the floor. We jumped up and listened, but everything was quiet. My wife was too scared to get out of bed, but she pushed me with her foot under the blanket and told me to look at what was there. I reluctantly got up and went to inspect the house, but everything was quiet and I didn't find any fallen objects. I went back to the bedroom and tried to fall asleep. A few minutes later we heard a terrible crash again. This time we were already sure that it wasn't our imagination. I jumped up and began to walk from room to room, trying to figure out what could have caused such a roar. Everything was in its place, and I didn't find anything on the floor. I was about to return to the bedroom when I suddenly felt a chill on my bare feet. I thought maybe my wife had left the window open, so I went to the window and opened the curtains. My heart almost sank from what I saw there. In the middle of a dark street, a disgusting old woman was looking at me with her big, white eyes. Her face was so terrible that it seemed as if she had already died a long time ago. Then I heard my wife's terrified scream. I ran into the bedroom and saw that my wife was screaming hysterically and muttering incessantly that she wanted to leave. She also looked out of the window and saw a terrible old woman. I grabbed a hammer and ran to the front door to find out what was going on. Running out into the street, I began to walk back and forth in circles, but the old woman was nowhere to be found. "She's gone." I went back to the house and tried to calm my wife down somehow, but that night we could no longer relax and go to bed in peace. During the day we calmed down a bit, but after dark our nerves were on edge again. We couldn't sleep, so we settled down in the living room and started watching TV. Everything was fine for a while, then, suddenly, the electricity went out all over the house. I went to the gym to check the electrical panel, but all the plugs were in place. I decided to go back to the kitchen, light the candles, and get a flashlight. On the way to the kitchen, I looked into the living room. It was dark, but I made out the silhouette of my wife sitting on the couch. I told her that everything was fine and that I would bring candles. Entering the kitchen, I was horrified to notice a human figure. I opened the drawer of the kitchen table, took out a flashlight and turned on the light. Pointing the beam at a man in the dark, I almost lost my mind. It was my wife. I told my wife to wait for me, and with a flashlight in my hand, I headed into the living room, trying to figure out who I saw there. I prayed that no one was there. My wife didn't argue with me. Fortunately, there was no one in the living room. As soon as we lit the candles and placed them on the fireplace, the light came on. We blew out the candles and decided to go to bed, but we couldn't fall asleep. After all, I really saw someone. At that moment, it began to dawn on me why we got the house at such a low price. Obviously, the former owners knew about everything that was going on here, but no one told us anything. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, the room was deadly cold. My wife was lying with her back to me. She was still asleep, so I covered her with a blanket and went downstairs to smoke. Going into the kitchen, I ran into my wife, who was smoking a cigarette there. She asked me why I carried her to the sofa while I stayed to sleep in the bedroom. I said I had no idea what she was talking about because just a few seconds ago, I had covered her with a blanket in our bedroom. With a feeling of growing fear, we decided to go back to the bedroom to check who was lying there in our bed. Going to the bedroom door, I quietly opened it and looked inside. Oh my God, do you know who I saw there? That awful old woman was lying in our bed. My wife screamed. I was speechless with horror, and we rushed to run. Once in the living room, my wife told me to call the police. That I dialed the number of the local police station, and when they picked up the phone there, I told them what was going on. They laughed, then threatened me with a fine if I didn't stop playing them. Then I called a few of our friends and briefly outlined to them the situation we were in. They came to us, and we searched the house together, but found nothing suspicious. When the friends left, the wife said that she was leaving and would stay with her mother. She said she'd only come back when I'd sorted out all the hell that was going on in the house. That I was left alone in the house. The first thing I decided to do was to call the former owners of the house. They told me they didn't know anything, but I could feel the concern in their voices. I realized that they were lying to me. As I found out later, they were also victims of this house, just like us, but they couldn't do anything about it, and just sold the house at the lowest price. And the house really had a terrible story. The next day I called the local priest. When he entered the house, he immediately said that he felt the presence of evil here, and advised me to leave the house immediately. I told him to do his job, and I don't need his unnecessary advice. He sprinkled the house with holy water and went around all the rooms, reading prayers and waving a censer. Then he handed me the bill for the service and left. To be honest, I didn't want to check whether the rite performed by the priest had worked, but I had no choice. I had nowhere to go. I was terribly afraid, so I bought myself a bottle of vodka, for courage. That evening I sat in the living room, watched TV and drank. Slowly I fell asleep. In the middle of the night I woke up because I desperately wanted to go to the toilet. I went to the toilet and stood over the toilet, pissing all over the toilet seat. Suddenly, I heard a loud knock on the front door. That I ran to the door and looked through the peephole. His wife was standing outside. I opened the door and tried to hug her, but she pushed me away and went upstairs to the bedroom. In the morning I was woken up by a phone call. When I answered, it turned out that my wife was calling. The first thing I asked her was, "Why are you calling me? Where are you?" She replied irritably, "Are you a complete idiot? I'm at my mother's." The hair on my head stood on end. I immediately ran out of the house, almost tearing the doors off their hinges. Once on the street, I looked back and looked at the house. There was a terrible old woman standing in the window of the second floor and looking at me. I came to the conclusion that after the priest performed the exorcism, the old woman had to leave the house, but then she deceived me, and I unwittingly allowed her to return. I had suffered such fear then that I had had enough. Soon we put the house up for sale again, and were able to sell it to a new family. They bought it for almost the same price that we bought it for. So, despite all that we had to go through, at least we didn't lose our money. Later I read in the news that this house burned down. The whole family was burned in the fire. They died suffocating in the smoke, and their charred bodies were found in the storeroom, where they were all crammed. That I think I know who they were hiding from there.